Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to look at the shortlist for the Booker Prize 2024. This is pretty exciting because, last year was my bitter Booker year. I wasn't so into anything that went on with the Booker, but, things are cyclical. There's always next year. The long list seemed very interesting. And there are some interesting developments with the shortlist. There is a pretty good combination of the expected books that you kind of felt pretty sure would make it onto the shortlist, and some surprise omissions, things that you really thought that might have a chance at winning or even just making the shortlist, and which are not coming through to the next round. So we will talk about that in a moment. Quick note. I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about what these books are about. If you want full descriptions of the books, I will link my long list reaction in the description box down below. I love to use a long list or a best of list as a tool of discovery to help me discover books that I hadn't heard of or challenge my perceptions about something that maybe I didn't think I wanted to read, things like that. So in the long list reaction, I went through every book and read the plot description of it and sort of made notes about what I might want to read and what I won't want to read. And because I haven't read all of these books, I should note right off the bat, these are not intended as reviews. I am not attempting to review any book that I have not read. However, you can follow a book prize, and without having read all of the books, you can take in a lot of the feedback from other people who have been reading the long list and following what the jury has said, and try to get a sense of what books might fit in with what the jury seems to be looking for this year, and get a sense of just what books people seem to like, because a jury needs to reach a consensus, and if readers are sort of reaching a consensus about something, it can give you a good idea of what might win. So I'm not attempting to review. I'm going off of what I've heard from other people who have reviewed them, going off of what the jury has said about these books and my own interest in reading these books. I have read 2 of them at this point, and I attempted a third. I did not get very far into it. And there is another book from the long list that didn't make it onto the short list that I am still waiting for at my library. Still. At the time they announced the long list, I had already been waiting a month and it hadn't become available. I am still waiting. But support your local libraries. So before we get into the shortlist again, I will note, if you are interested in reading any of these books, I will have affiliate links to all of them except for Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood in the description box down below. The exception is because that book is not currently released in the United States. I am sure, given its success with the Booker so far, it will be getting a U.S. release date, but it is not available right now. So you can use those links, give me a bit of a kickback, or you can support your local libraries or support your local independent bookstores. Those are great things for you to do. And if you are interested in Stoneyard Devotional and you live in the United States, like I said, I'm willing to bet it is going to get released over here at some point, probably sooner rather than later. But if you don't want to wait, there are options for ordering overseas these days. So that part's not difficult. The difficulty will probably be in shipping and what shipping will cost. So only you will know what the right option for you is. But let's start talking about the shortlist. So the shortlist includes 5 women and 1 male author. That is the largest amount of female authors represented on a shortlist, I believe, ever. And that's pretty cool. That is pretty cool, not going to lie. I hadn't noticed this, but it did point out in an article on the Booker website that a woman has not won the Booker Prize since 2019, which was a special circumstance because that's when there was a tie between 2 women. So a woman has not won the Booker Prize since 2019, but 2 women won in 2019, Bernardine Evaristo and Margaret Atwood. And so far, women have won the prize 20 times since it was created in 1969. And we'll talk a little bit about what might win. I kind of think the male author who made it onto the shortlist is the odds-on favorite. So that makes the gender disparity on the shortlist a little interesting, but I think there are avenues for one of the female authors to win, certainly. And certainly it is great that so many women have been recognized by the Booker Prize. And the way they describe this is that the list features stories which transport readers around the world and beyond Earth's atmosphere, From the battlefields of the First World War to a spiritual retreat in rural Australia, from America's deep south in the 19th century to a remote Dutch house in the 1960s, from the International Space Station to a cave network beneath the French countryside. Among other things, the shortlisted books explore the gravitational pull of home and family, the contested nature of truth and history, and the extent to which we reveal our real selves to others. And then just on the note of interesting things, 3 of this year's shortlisted authors have been nominated for the prize before, and 2 of them know how it feels to be shortlisted. That is Percival Everett, who is the only man in contention for James, and Rachel Kushner, who was shortlisted for the Mars Room before. Percival Everett was shortlisted for The Trees previously, and now Rachel Kushner is shortlisted again. Samantha Harvey was longlisted in 2009 for The Wilderness, and while the other writers may be new to the shortlist, 2 of them are no strangers to literary prizes. Anne Michaels, sorry, not Anne Held. She wrote the book Held. Anne Michaels won the Women's Prize for Fugitive Pieces back when it was known as the Orange Prize, and Charlotte Wood won the Stella Prize for The Natural Way of Things. There is only one debut novel, and that is The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden. Van der Wouden is also the first Dutch author to be shortlisted for the Booker Prize. In fact, this is particularly interesting because The Safekeep was written in English. Yael van der Wouden is trilingual, I believe is what it said. Yeah, trilingual. So The Safekeep was written in English, but the Dutch edition, which was co-translated with Yael van der Wouden, was actually published first. So that's just a little interesting bit about that. And then they had a little thing about themes, and I want to read that before we actually start talking about what these books are. Is there a single theme that unites all 6 books? In their own unique ways, they all explore the gravitational forces exerted on us by the place we call home. Many of the protagonists have been uprooted. They may be in exile, Stoneyard Devotional, in hiding, James, or on a mission, Creation Lake and Orbital. And most are looking not forward, but back to where they've come from. Those who do manage to ground themselves at home may feel they are on fragile territory, their sense of security under threat from outsiders, the safekeep, or old wounds, held. This may be a shortlist about our essential human need to belong in a world that makes so many people feel lost and unwelcome. All of that comes from the Booker website. I will link that down below if you'd like to navigate around and check out some of the information. I will say I watched the live stream where they made the announcement, and it was very erratic. It kept freezing and cutting out, so I actually missed the second book to make the shortlist completely and had to wait until it was over to find out what that book was, because when it was over, they finally showed a photo of the 6 books. So I had to just look and see, like, well, okay, well, which one did I not know about? And that's how I found out. So not the best viewing experience, but I do love that they do these live stream reveals. So anyway, let's dive in and start talking about the books. And one by one, we'll start with the most obvious one, because I don't think anyone is surprised that James by Percival Everett ended up making it onto the shortlist. This is a book that really feels like it is potentially going places. And I'm starting to get in my head about that, because when you start to feel certain about things, it feels like that's when things start to fall apart or you start to be wrong. Sometimes people don't want to do what is expected, and that makes you wonder how far James will ultimately go. I have talked many times about how I am waiting with just such anticipation for someone to become the first person to win both a Pulitzer Prize and a Booker Prize. So far, it has not happened that someone who has already won a Pulitzer Prize wins a Booker Prize, or vice versa. So that also makes me start to wonder, is the most likely scenario that someone just wins both prizes for the same book? And James feels like the book that could do that. Percival Everett has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction before, but he has not won yet. And I think if you ask anyone who follows the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, they would tell you that James feels like the frontrunner. And frontrunner status with the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction is very dicey, especially in this day and age. I did a whole thing about the state of the Pulitzer Prize. I'll link that video down below. But it feels like the Pulitzer jury is, in particular, wants to flout the notion of doing the predicted thing. And I realize that is a wild thing to say a year after Demon Copperhead and Trust tied for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. But overall, it feels like they don't want to do what you expect them to do. So there's a tough road for James with the Booker Prize and with the Pulitzer, because it would have to overcome a lot of its own hype to win. And it would have to overcome the sense of... I don't want to call it anticlimactic, but I feel like Pulitzer juries might feel that it would be anticlimactic, or maybe the Booker jury, because this is the book that a lot of people are expecting good things for, if that makes sense. But I really think that if a book is going to win both the Booker Prize and the Pulitzer Prize, this feels like the one that could do it. And we'll just have to wait and see. Someday someone is going to win both the Booker and the Pulitzer, and I'm going to be so excited. Carol Shields probably came the closest, but she did that through a total fluke, because she did it at a time when American authors were not eligible for the Booker Prize. She won a Pulitzer Prize for The Stone Diaries, and that book was also shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And that happened through a fluke of citizenship. Carol Shields was born in the United States, moved to Canada, and I believe she had dual citizenship. So she was eligible for the Pulitzer because she was born in the United States, but she was eligible for the Booker because she lived and worked in Canada and I believe had Canadian citizenship. So it feels like that's sort of the closest we've come for like one book to win both. And, Paul Harding has previously won a Pulitzer, and he was up for a Booker last year for This Other Eden. And Elizabeth Strout has previously won a Pulitzer, and she has at least been longlisted. I can't remember if she has been shortlisted. So we've had some authors who have previously won come close, and it's just interesting. I find this fascinating. I know it's going to happen. And the reason I harp on that so much is that it feels like James could be the book that gets us the very first joint Booker and Pulitzer win. And I find that really exciting. So if you're unfamiliar with this book, I will just read you two quick blurbs from their website. I'm not going to go into the plot very much. This is described as a profound meditation on identity, belonging, and the sacrifices we make to protect the ones we love, which reimagines the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It also says, according to the judges, this is a captivating response to Mark Twain's classic that is both a bold exploration of a dark chapter in history and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It feels like a book that a lot of people like. And I when I read it, I admit I was more muted on the ending. But I do really like the book. And it has definitely sat with me since I finished it. And for that reason, I would be happy to see this book succeed. I would be happy to see it win the Booker. I would be happy to see it win the Pulitzer. And it is now in the mix for the National Book Award as well. So I'd be happy to see it win that as well. I find it fascinating that a lot of people tend to think you need to split all of the prizes, that it would be unfair for someone to win more than one. Like, there were a lot of people I spoke to in comments who were upset when Barbara Kingsolver won both the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the Women's Prize. I think that's an amazing achievement, and I celebrate it. It helps that I really liked Demon Copperhead. So I think it's delightful that this book is in the running for the Booker, still being on the shortlist, that it's in the running for the National Book Award, and that it could be a contender for the Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer doesn't do a long list or a short list, so we really won't find out until the announcement is made. But I feel like I am rooting for this book and just waiting to see how far it will ultimately go. And I think it has a very good chance of winning the Booker Prize, but we'll see. We shall see. And I'm very happy that I have this signed first edition of it that I ordered from Parnassus Books in Nashville. The next one is The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden. This was something that I had included on my list of my most anticipated books for the middle of 2024. I've done 3 anticipated book lists for the year, one in the beginning of the year, one in the middle, and then one for anything coming out toward the end of the year. And this one was in the middle. It just sounded really fascinating to me. I was fascinated by the queer angle of it. I also just think the American cover is gorgeous. So I reached out to the publisher, Avid Reader Press, and asked them if they would send an advanced reader's copy, and they agreed to do so. And I read it once they sent it to me, and I enjoyed it. I will say the first half of the book feels very familiar in a way that kind of feels stultifying. it just feels like it's relying too much on things that you've read before, situations that you have experienced many times in books and movies. And even putting a queer spin on that setup doesn't make it feel fresh enough for me. And then the difficulty in talking about this book is that there's a turn in the plot at about the halfway point, or maybe a little past the halfway point. And to talk about where it goes after that would spoil the experience of reading the book. So I won't do that, but I will say that after it takes that turn, this becomes a fascinating book. And it left me thinking about a lot of issues of complicity, complacency, and what people do when they can get away with it. And history and the hidden nuggets of history that we don't necessarily know and maybe don't want to know because we would rather not be forced to think about the uncomfortable truths of where we live. And I think anybody who lives in the United States on land that was taken from Native American people can understand and relate to that, and on land that was also cared for in many places by enslaved people. You know, these are things that people don't necessarily want to think about, and those are issues that you start to grapple with the safekeep. And I won't say any more because, again, I feel like this is a book that you should experience for yourself. And your mileage may vary. Maybe that back half of the book won't make up for the first half of it, but I thought it did. I admit I didn't think it would make it onto the shortlist, but then as I started listening to feedback from other people who were reading through the long list, there were a lot of books that felt like misfires to several people, and I did start to think to myself, well, I didn't think The Safekeep was going to make the shortlist because I assumed that there was going to be better, and now that I'm listening to people talk about their experience reading the long list, it actually feels like The Safekeep has a chance. I did not predict The Safekeep on my own list of predictions, and I should have. Oh well. Here are the quick things that they say about this. An exhilarating tale of twisted desires, histories, and homes, and the legacy of one of the 20th century's greatest tragedies. And to get the note from the jury, a remarkable debut about obsession and loss set in an isolated Netherlands house. The author draws us into a world as carefully calibrated as a Dutch still life. And I think they've pretty much nailed it with that description. Let's move on to Orbital by Samantha Harvey. This is the one that I attempted. I got it from my library, and ultimately I decided not to read it. My general rule in these situations is if I get 50 pages into a book or about 15% into an audiobook, I count it as something that I DNF if I decide not to continue. I also wait to mark something as something that I'm currently reading until I have read 50 pages or 15% of the audio. And usually I don't talk about a book if it doesn't meet that threshold, because I feel like if I don't meet that threshold, I have not experienced enough of the book to weigh in. So it would be irresponsible for me to do that. Now, I only read about 20, maybe 25 pages of Orbital. And the only reason I did talk about it was because I knew something like this could happen. Like, even if Orbital had not made the shortlist, it felt like my experience of deciding that it was not a book I wanted to read would come into play. So basically, I heard some feedback from other people who did read the long list and felt like they kind of got the point with Orbital very quickly, and it was very repetitive and didn't necessarily seem like something that was worth the amount of pages devoted to it, even though it's very short. It's novella length. If you need something for Shorty September, Orbital counts. It's under 200 pages. So I picked it up, and in the first 20 pages or however many pages I got into it, I was not feeling the joy. It's beautifully written, and I just didn't feel invested. I kind of felt like I get the point. It was doing a lot of listing, and that is not something that I respond to in a book. It apparently is something that a lot of other people respond to, because I read a paragraph that involved 3 separate lists, and some people commented and said, I actually think that's great. And I think, that's something I always push for in literature. if a book isn't something that I respond to, it doesn't mean it's a bad book. It just means I didn't respond to it. So I'm not surprised so many people, including the jury for the Booker Prize, have enjoyed this. It just didn't seem like something I was going to get anything out of. And then I skipped to the last 5 or 10 pages of the book and sort of felt like, I get the point. I don't think I need to continue reading this. So I returned it. And once I put it down, I realized that I had read a book by Samantha Harvey before and just felt meh about it. And that was The Western Wind. And I just didn't know that somehow. I didn't make the connection that this was the same Samantha Harvey. Oh, well. 6 astronauts rotate in the International Space Station. They are there to do vital work, but slowly they begin to wonder, what is life without Earth? What is Earth without humanity? And from the judges, we get 6 astronauts observe Earth's splendor while navigating bereavement, loneliness, and mission fatigue. Compact yet beautifully expansive, this is a love letter to our planet. And that is Orbital. I know a lot of people have had very different reactions to Orbital from me. And like I said, judging whether or not a book is good or bad is sometimes useless because maybe something I don't respond to is something that you like. Orbital just didn't feel like a book that I felt like I needed to read. So I will leave it alone and let the people who enjoy it. And actually the same is pretty much true of Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner, even though I have not actually attempted to read it. It's just that the premise only sounded interesting to me in that it has a spy angle. And from what I've heard from people who have read it as part of their reading of the long list, it just doesn't sound like something I want to commit to reading. There are so many things that I would rather try to fit in this year before I would read Creation Lake. So I feel pretty comfortable sitting this one out and letting other people who are into it experience it and either love it or hate it or whatever they will feel. I do feel just a little surprised that it made the shortlist, given that it feels like a cilantro book. And some people get confused. When I say a cilantro book, I mean it's love it or hate it. So, it has that cilantro quality where some people will dive in and they will just love it. But to some people, it tastes like soap and they can't stand it. So that is a cilantro book. And Creation Lake has seemed to be that so far among the people who have read it. A woman is caught in the crossfire between the past and the future in this part spy novel, part profound treatise on human history. At some point, I will need to decide if I'm going to read this book to be prepared for the Pulitzer announcement next year, but I feel like I'm going to wait on that. If Creation Lake ends up winning the Booker Prize, it is also longlisted for the National Book Award. So both James and Creation Lake are in the running for the National Book Award. I might start thinking about it if it ends up showing up on like the New York Times Best Books of the Year, things like that. I might reconsider, but until then, I'm very happy sitting this out. We also have a profound and irresistible page-turner about a spy for hire who infiltrates a commune of eco-activists in rural France. The prose is thrilling, the ideas electrifying. And that is what they have to say about Creation Lake. Let's get to Stoneyard Devotional. I feel like this book was one that people didn't really know. It had flown under the radar for a lot of people when the long list was announced. And usually there is always a book that people didn't really know about when the long list was announced. And then when people read the long list, it feels like it gathers steam. And that to me is Stoneyard Devotional this year, because even people who were pretty mid on the Booker long list seemed to like Stoneyard Devotional. And the way people have talked about it makes it sound fascinating. So I feel like I'm sort of stuck in this realm where I don't want to order Stoneyard Devotional from overseas. So I'm going to wait, but it does sound interesting. And when it is available in the US, maybe if it wins the Booker Prize, and it does feel like it could build that sense of momentum and carry through, especially since the jury this year feels like it is really looking for books that do well on a reread, which is part of their criteria for the Booker Prize, and prizing literary works. And Stoneyard Devotional seems to have that. Here's what they say. The past comes knocking in Charlotte Wood's fearless exploration of forgiveness, grief, and female friendship. They also say a woman settles into a monastery in rural Australia and discovers that no shelter is impermeable. This novel thrilled and chilled the judges. And I know a lot of people have been frustrated that Australian authors have not had much of a presence with the Booker, and maybe this will help. It does feel like that's a bit of a bittersweet thing because so many people had been rooting for praiseworthy to make it onto the Booker long list, and then it didn't. So, and there was some hard feelings about that among people who have really liked Praiseworthy. So it's interesting, but I do feel like Stoneyard Devotional is a book that is gaining traction as people discover the long list, and as people will continue to read the shortlist. It feels like it could build a lot of momentum, maybe even win. We'll see. The final book on the shortlist is Held by Ann Michaels. This has definitely been a cilantro book among the people who have been reading the long list that I have seen. And again, that just means it's kind of love it or hate it. There's not too much in between. And in fact, I've seen a fair amount of negative response to this book. Fugitive Pieces is a book I really need to catch up to, by the way, just apropos of nothing. I wanted to mention that. But I have not read Held and I have not read Fugitive Pieces. In a narrative that spans 4 generations, moments of connection and consequence ignite and reignite as the century unfolds. And it also says a kaleidoscopic novel about war, trauma, science, faith, and above all, love and human connection. Reading it seems to alter your state of mind. I don't know how helpful it is to go down the rabbit hole of trying to predict what members of the jury will like, but I did start to think to myself once the shortlist was announced, it does seem like Held and Orbital were books that Yi Yoon Lee, who is an author who is on the jury, would really like and respond to. And I can't really speak for the other people on the jury. I've read a book by Yi Yoon Lee, which I guess is where I feel a little more qualified to make assumptions about what you would like. But yeah, it definitely feels like Orbital and Held sound like things that Yi Yoon Lee would like. Maybe that gives them a bit of an edge for the prize as well. I genuinely don't know. I genuinely don't. But it still feels as though James is the book to beat. And especially since some of the books that felt like the most direct competition to James didn't make the shortlist, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So it feels like James is the book to beat. It's interesting that the only man who had made it onto the shortlist feels like the book to beat, and we'll have to see. It does feel like Stoneyard Devotional to me seems like the dark horse contender, the one that could sort of build momentum and work its way up to a win. And we'll just have to see if they. The Safekeep does have a lot of really interesting things, and I mentioned in my Friday reads where I sort of did my prediction for what could make the shortlist that I think the Safekeep is something that could benefit from a reread because there's that twist halfway through. So if you go back, it's kind of like watching The Sixth Sense once you know what the ending is, because you get to see how it was all done and how it all played out. And the Safekeep would definitely benefit from that sense of a reread. And will that happen a third time as they go back and reread again before they decide on a winner? Like once you've gone back and pieced all of that together, does it benefit a third time? I don't know. So it'll be interesting to see how all of this plays out. Let's quickly talk about the books that were on the long list that we say goodbye to. First is Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. I have not read this yet, but I really want to, obviously, because I have a copy of it, and I really liked They're There. Wandering Stars is a sort of sequel, sort of prequel to They're There, and I really want to get around to reading it. I did include this in my list of predictions, and obviously that ended up not coming true. I only got 2 out of my predictions correct, by the way. And even as I was talking about the books that I had made predictions for, I almost talked myself out of Wandering Stars. If I hadn't been in the act of filming, I probably would have made a change to my prediction list, but I decided I didn't want to stop filming and do that. So I stuck with it. And here we are. I got this one wrong. But it would have been nice because Tommy Orange is the first Native American to have been longlisted for the Booker Prize. The next book that didn't make it was Wild Houses by Colin Barrett. And when I did my prediction, I said I feel like the one book that seems guaranteed not to be on the shortlist is Wild Houses. And then I laughed and said, watch it be on the shortlist. So at least I was correct about that. And then there's This Strange Eventful History by Claire Messud. That is something that I predicted would make it onto the shortlist. Although it was a pretty heavily cilantro book as well, there was a lot of mixed to negative response to it. So I guess I shouldn't be entirely surprised that it didn't make it onto the shortlist. Playground by Richard Powers does surprise me because the booker has seemed very enamored of Richard Powers. And although the response I've seen to the book so far is just a touch mixed, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a cilantro book. But because it's Richard Powers, because it has such a heavy ecological message and talks about earth and connection, which are things they've talked about, it did seem like Playground would be on the list. It was something that I predicted, and it does feel surprising that it's not. But Richard Powers is going to be fine. He is a Pulitzer Prize winner. I didn't mention him earlier. He is a Pulitzer Prize winner who has been in contention for the Booker, and I can't believe I forgot that earlier. And then we also have Enlightenment by Sarah Perry. I'm not entirely surprised that one didn't make it. It doesn't feel like that's a book that people have not enjoyed, but it doesn't sound like a book that would grow in your appreciation on reread and sort of unlock hidden layers and meanings. So I'm not entirely surprised it didn't make it onto the shortlist. I am very surprised not to see My Friends by Hisham Matar. That does feel like a book that a lot of people were liking. It feels like a book with a powerful message, and it feels surprising. So when I say that the biggest contenders to James didn't make it onto the shortlist, My Friends is pretty specifically one of the ones I am referring to. Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle definitely turned out to be a cilantro book on this list. And again, that means love it or hate it. And it feels like most people did not enjoy it. And that is the book that I have been waiting for my library to get to me since it was released in June. The New York Times book review is a huge fan of Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle. I fully expect to see it on their list of the 10 best books of 2024 because they have been so bullish on it. And that is not a pun on Rita Bullwinkle's last name, by the way, but that did just jump out at me as I was talking. So I was kind of surprised and delighted to see it on the Booker long list because it just would not have occurred to me that it would show up there. I was a little surprised it didn't make it onto the National Book Award for Fiction long list, but I'm not surprised to see that it is not advancing because a lot of the people who read Headshot didn't seem to enjoy it, the sort of central gimmick of it. And we don't have to get into what that gimmick is. And in my Friday reads, I had sort of wondered if perhaps in a way similar to the Safekeep, once you know the ultimate outcome of Headshot, I speculated about whether or not it would benefit from a reread in a sort of similar way. And somebody left a comment just to say, well, knowing the winner doesn't change the outcome of the book. And they meant it in a sort of flippant way. But I feel like knowing the outcome could make a reread a little more interesting, but it does feel like that is not the type of book that would have the same sense of joy and reward in revisiting. And that's hard to say that because I've actually read The Safekeep and I haven't read Headshot yet. Support your library, but I'm a little frustrated by how long it is taking for that hold to come available. It's nice that I love libraries. I will always support libraries. It's just a fact of life that sometimes there are long waits to get the books that you are interested in. And that is the way it is. So I feel like James is the one that is the odds-on favorite to win. I feel like that's the one that most people would be predicting at the moment. Whether or not that will turn out to be true, or whether or not another book will sort of come out of nowhere. I am wondering about Stoneyard Devotional, but we shall find out. So let me know what you think of the shortlist, the long list, and if you're having a bitter Booker year in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and we will be back. Until next time, happy reading.